Thank you. Thanks so much, Farokh. Also to thanks to Sneha, to Diksha, to Bharat for organizing this talk, and also for sustaining what seemed to be a dynamic set of conversations around the city's history, read from its present. So I'll start a short presentation now. It's very much, as you see, a work in progress, and I look forward to the conversation that follows. In my research, I examine how urban worlds are made with water. And I theorize urban processes with water, not just because water is a site of significant contemporary concern, but because water provides a different lens with which to understand cities and urbanization. Much of our understanding of cities has been built on solid ground, and ground here not just as metaphor, but also as interest, right? Ground, reality, real estate have been ways in which cities have been understood, the ways in which developments of cities have been imagined, and the ways in which progress is envisioned. In this project, I will share some new work thinking about the city in and from ongoing processes in the sea, right? And trying to rethink the city from the sea. Now, already, and this is, I think, in no small part due to the effects of climate change that are already here. Many cities in India are being battered by the consequences of climate change. It is present, right? And think about what's been happening in India over the last 6 months. 6 months ago, in May, Cyclone Amphan devastated the homes and lives in the Sundarbans and in Kolkata. 5 months ago, many of you will remember the cyclone that almost hit Mumbai, Cyclone Nisarga, which threatened to inundate up to 3 kilometers of coastline near Mumbai in Uran, before the cyclone veered south and saved the city in more ways than one. And then just 2 months ago, an unseasonal cyclonic storm killed over 81 people in the city of Hyderabad in flash floods that ensued, right? So these are just 3 major urban disasters in Indian cities, 3 major climate disasters in Indian cities in the last 6 months. Rising sea levels and the increased threat of likelihood of extreme weather events have caused significant concern both among scientists and city planners all over the world, right? So the New York Times a few years ago ran a 3-part special on this very topic, the dates there if you want to take a look at it. But then also Somni Sengupta and the New York Times have been writing a wonderful series of articles on climate change around the world. That the image you see of the church submerged in Manila in the top right comes from one of her pieces that looks at the ways in which climate change is causing planners to fundamentally rethink cities and urbanization, particularly coastal cities. Now, Amitabh Ghosh made an interesting point many years ago in his book, Great Derangement, when he draws attention to the family resemblances around all the cities that are facing catastrophic flooding risks in the near future and in the present. And what he says is this, is that all of these cities were all built and consolidated around the same time to service colonial empires, right? So whether we're thinking of New York, or we're thinking of Mumbai, whether we're thinking of Manila, or we're thinking of San Francisco, Singapore, or Jakarta, all these cities that were built right on the sea were built at a particular time. They were built at a time where colonial officials imagined a control over nature, but also a control over empires. And I think much of what we're seeing today comes out of this, this history of building large cosmopolitan regions out of wetlands, oftentimes almost always out of wetlands, and in the sea. Mumbai is of course no exception to this. Many of you, all of you who've lived in Mumbai know that the floods are no stranger to the city. They never have been. But all of you will also recognize a fundamental change in the degree and intensity of flooding in the last few years. Mumbai frequently features on what I'm calling now the endangered cities list, list of cities that are threatened by catastrophic climate change events, both in the present and in the near future. Now, what can we do? What I suggest today is that the crisis confronting Mumbai in particular is not just a crisis of capital or not having enough money to do the right things or even know-how of what to do, but it's a fundamental crisis of the imagination, right? That we cannot imagine living in a city like Mumbai any differently than we do today, and yet differently we must live. The answers I suggest require us to completely rethink and reimagine cities, not living with water, but living in water. Drinking water, flood water, rainwater, all of these are waters that we need to like think from and with to reimagine the future of living in cities like Mumbai. Much of the work that I do as an anthropologist is ethnographic, so I spend significant amounts of time with communities with whom I work and from whom I learn. For this project, I spent a significant amount of time with the fishers, particularly in Worli Koliwada, but also with scientists working in Mumbai and also urban planners in the different planning agencies of the city. Gyan Prakash, the author of this wonderful book, Mumbai Fables, historian, has suggested that Mumbai has been made by a double colonization. That is, it's been made by a colonization of Indian subjects by the British, right? The city didn't exist before colonization as a city. It existed as a settlement. So it's been made as a colonization of Indian subjects by the British, but the city has also been made by a colonization of the sea by land. Now, sometimes this is called reclamation, but this process is more accurately described as landfill, right? And reclamation is a constant present past in the city's history, and that the second colonization of the sea by land continues to this day, over 70 years after independence from the first colonization. Now, this is not a story that's particular to Mumbai alone. In her History of the Making of Kolkata, historian Debjani Bhattacharya provides a wonderful account of the ways in which cartography, finance, and law worked to drain Calcutta's wetlands to literally make Kolkata in a floodplain, much like Mumbai. And I recall that slide of Amphan that I showed you a couple of slides ago, right? There's reasons that these cities are being haunted by climate change in the present. In Mumbai, landscape architects and planners Dilip Dakuna and Anuradha Mathur have produced a series of beautiful maps in this book Sok that I encourage all of you to read, that shows how cartography, map making, not only represented the city, but fundamentally made the city. And I want to talk about that making for a little while here. In Sok, Mathur and Dakuna draw attention to the practices and predicaments of cartographers who sought to map a city that was sometimes wet and sometimes dry, right? And they detail this wonderful quote from John Fryer, who was like involved in this process in the 1670s, who described not one island of Bombay, or even the 7 islands that we know the city to be, but I quote, spots of ground that joined and separated with the tides. And this is a fundamental problem of cartography, particularly in an estuarine region like Mumbai, that is not actually well reflected in the debates and discussions around the city, particularly around the idea of Mumbai being 7 islands, right? And this is an epistemological question. How do you represent a city that is dry sometimes and wet at other times? Not just between the monsoons and the dry season, but also in the days, the high tides and the low tides, and also across the months, right? The spring tides and neap tides, and the city would flood differently depending on the height of the high tide. Now, cartographers conveniently mapped the city during its dry season and at dry times. They mapped the city at low tide to reveal what became the territories of empire, right? As Dilip Dakuna and Anuradha Mathur point out in their book, these beautiful maps then did not just make the city, they also made the reality and the reality that the city came to embody. Colonial officials then built infrastructures to make sure the city looked as it did in the maps during dry times. And so making maps in this way, they did not just represent the city, they also made the city solid and dry and profitable for the exploits of empire. The second point they make in the book is that making maps did not just make land or make land dry, but they also positioned land against the sea. Today, the reclamation projects that we see taking place continue to position land against the sea. And it's a battle that land will never win. So another point about mapping and cartography of the kinds that we've been noticing is that they do not just make the city visible, but they also make the sea invisible, right? So today, much all of our urban planning ends at the coastline. It's a shifting line, as we notice, but it is a line. The sea appears both in films, in government maps, in planning documents, as undifferentiated and homogeneous nature, as empty water, as water in the singular that just rises and falls with the tides. Now, these maps are used and reproduced in urban development projects that reproduce the same silences of an empty sea. The life of the sea, filled as it is with the work of fishermen, of fish, the work that the sea does in processing the tremendous amount of sewage, and the coastal ecologies of the city, all of these have been made invisible, completely invisible in coastal planning processes in the city. It is not just maps that do this, but also the urban development projects that are built on these maps. Take, for example, Mumbai's most audacious project now under construction. The coastal road is set to be nearly 30-kilometer long road that will largely be built on hectares of landfill along Mumbai's western coast. This road is being built on intertidal regions that thousands of Kodi fishers will work on to live, providing the city with food. The coastal road is built on a fragile intertidal ecology, which includes fish breeding areas, corals, dolphins, many of which I did not know about before working in the sea. Because for me, like for many other residents of the city, the sea was empty. Now, what I want to suggest here, there's a lot I can say about the coastal road, but what I just want to suggest here, or draw attention to here, is the way in which planning documents for the coastal road continue to reproduce the sea as empty, right? So that any landfill, therefore, is progressive development. It's not necessarily removal or reduction and destruction, but development. It is no accident, through no act of oversight, that Mumbai's fishers, their fishing commons, and their histories were overlooked in the permitting processes, and that their consent was not taken prior to the commencement of the road. Neither is it an accident that the city did not commission a single ecological study of the region they proposed to reclaim, even though these studies were required for the permitting process. The road, like colonial land, is being made through the doctrine of aqua nullius, right? Of seeing water as empty so that it can then be developed. The city needs to not know about the lives and stories of the sea. They need to not know this so that they can fill the sea with stones and sand. Now, this is colonization in the classic sense, to the extent that extant life worlds of fishers, commons, fishing grounds, ecologies of zoanthids, crabs, corals, and lobsters are made invisible so that the sea can be occupied and made valuable through landfill and rubble. But this is not the right time to ignore the sea. It never has been, but it's even more so the case now. The sea was never quiet, and in the future, it will be even less so. With climate change, cities now ignore the sea at their own peril. These are just some scientific figures that I've been working with in the last couple of years. The sea level is rising 3 times faster since 2000 than in the whole period between 1900 and 2000, right? So already in the first 20 years of 2000, of the 2000s, it's risen 3 times more. And there'll be an increase in the number of heavy rain days to the extent of 20% in and around Mumbai and Maharashtra. The monsoons are intensifying owing to rising sea surface temperatures. The warming Indian Ocean, the Indian Ocean is the fastest warming ocean in the world. The Arabian Sea is the fastest warming part of that Indian Ocean. And this is causing tremendous changes to the dynamics, both of the monsoon, but also of cyclonic winds. Now, historically, for the 300 years or so that Mumbai has been filled, the Arabian Sea has been very quiet. It had been averaging less than 1 cyclone a year for the whole 300-year history between 1700 and 2000. But between 2000 and now, the average number of cyclones has gone from less than 1 to 4. So we can now expect 4 cyclones in the Arabian Sea a year. And this increase is directly attributable to climate change, right? So the increase in the number of cyclones in the Arabian Sea that we are seeing, and we can expect to continue seeing, is directly a consequence of climate change. Now, it is not just these global changes that are affecting Mumbai's seas, but also regional and urban intensifications that are changing the sea. Much of all of Mumbai's sewage, actually, whether it is collected in your sewers and drains, or it is directly deposited through nalas into rivers, all of the sewage is basically untreated when it arrives in the sea. And in the monsoons, a lot of the sewage then gets mixed with garbage that gets flushed through the rivers as well. Many of you will now notice these garbage tides that are an annual feature of every monsoon that visits the city. So we have higher, more turbid seas that are carrying more of the city's waste. On the bottom right-hand side, you see a remote sensing map of Mumbai that was done by colleagues at IIT, Arun Anand and his team, that actually show the sewage plumes that emerge in the sea when the sewage is finally released, right? So all of Mumbai's sewage is actually, much of Mumbai's sewage is actually sent through sewage outfalls 3 kilometers into the sea and released at that point, right? So at number 3 in that figure and number 4 in the figure, those are the sewage outfalls of Worli and Bandra. And you can actually see the discoloration, which indexes the lower oxygen waters of those that are a result of those sewage outfalls, right? So the sea is not just empty, clean, pure water, but it's also filled with sewage and waste. That's something that fishermen would always talk to me about when they were trying to work in the sea, about how the sewage is causing a drop in the catch of fish. Sewage might also be hosting another traveler noticed in Mumbai just a couple of weeks ago. This is sea sparkle that was photographed by my friend and colleague Shaunak Modi in Juhu, which is this the blue bioluminescence, which is actually a species of Noctiluca. Noctiluca scintillans is a species of bioluminescent algae that is now proliferating in the Arabian Sea more and more. And work that's been done by Helga Gomes and Joachim Goes here at Columbia have shown how these Noctiluca plumes, while they look very beautiful, are actually directly a result of lower oxygen levels in the sea. And they cause a different ecology, not of fish, but of salp, of squid, and of jellyfish, right? So a kind of eutrophication that is enhanced by the fact that the sea is actually warmer and oxygen levels are actually lower. We're not exactly clear if this might be related, but because there are these increased numbers of fish die-offs and fish kills, scientists are trying to understand if these fish kills are a consequence of lower oxygen in the sea or of coastal pollution. And of course, these are two interrelated phenomena. And so there are fish kills that are reported every year somewhere between Mumbai and Goa that are being noticed by fishermen and others that are living on the coastline. So we have a fundamental change, not just in the oxygen levels of the sea, but the whole ecology of the sea is changing. So what you see in the bottom right map is of Helga and Joachim's work when they show how this Noctiluca is actually long was constrained to the Omani coast, but now is actually traveling much along the Indian coast as well. So these processes are not just transforming seas, but also cities, the food they require, and the kinds of relationships that they have in and with their seas. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about planning. On the right here, you see a map that was made by a wonderful architect, Shara Anand, no relation, that drew on these historic maps, but also the climate central map of Mumbai in 2050, to make the point that in some ways, the Mumbai that we expect to see in 2050 will be temporarily wet and dry, much like the Mumbai of 1700. Around the world, administrators addressing climate change have sought to do this in two ways, right? The first is through carbon mitigation projects, right? These are projects to reduce the amount of carbon that cities produce, to change their energy sources, to encourage public transit, to weatherize buildings so that they aren't as energy intensive. Projects to actually reduce the amount of carbon that's put out in the atmosphere to reduce the speed of global warming and consequently then the speed of climate change. The second set of projects are adaptation projects. These are ways in which architects and planners are thinking of reorganizing cities to accommodate climate change that is already baked in, right? So much of the climate change that has been, much of the carbon that has been put into the atmosphere will have and is having irreversible effects. So we do, even if we bring carbon emissions down to zero, we still need to think about ways in which to adapt cities to the carbon that is already in the atmosphere. So adaptation projects involve a rethinking of urban processes to accommodate and adapt intensified monsoons, sea level rise, storm surges, and the like. Now, despite the critical challenges that are posed to Mumbai, planners in Mumbai are not quite doing either mitigation projects or adaptation projects in the city. And this is actually fundamentally interesting to me because the whole idea of planning is to look towards the future, and there's very little looking towards the future of climate change in their documents and work. So why is this? Why is this the case? It's not like planners are not doing anything. Planners are very hardworking. It's just that they're doing a lot of other things. Planning of the 1960s variety. For example, a lot of planning right now in Mumbai, in the MMRDA and the BMC, is involved in transportation projects, the metro, the coastal road, the Trans-Harbour Sea Link, the airport, and so on. This is planning of the 1960s variety that sought to modernize Mumbai. Now, this is a problem because this actually makes climate change worse, right? The fossil fuel powered modernization projects of the 1960s actually makes mitigation harder to do. It actually exacerbates the problems of climate change. There are a whole series of modernization projects that aren't as carbon intensive that have since been discovered and have since been worked with in cities around the world, whether the cities are London, New York, Singapore, or even Bogota. But those are not the projects that the city government is working with substantively, right? And I think part of the problem with this, and I think this is true not just of cities or of Mumbai, but also of India, is that the environment is read as a supplement to urban life, as something that we can take care of once our basic needs are addressed. It is something that's somewhat a luxury, right? Or it's seen as that, even as the effects of climate change and the effects of environmental destruction actually fall on the poorest communities hardest and first. But there's also this sense that let climate change come, and then we'll make plans, and then we will see. Um, but the cyclone Nisarga reminds us that for cities like Mumbai, climate change is already here. It came in, it came in June, and it's not just an environmental crisis. It's not just an environmental problem. Climate change is an urban problem, and it needs to be treated with all the seriousness of urban development problems in the city. So here, I suggest that one way to start to do this is to rethink cities from water, right? From the water that Mumbai is made out of. And we need to reimagine Mumbai in the sea. But we also need to rethink the city and urbanization, not just from planning offices up on high, but from what people are already doing in Mumbai to cope with the effects of living in flood or living in wetness. And already there are many communities in Mumbai that are doing just that. So in 2018, Anuradha Mathur, Dilip Dikuna, and I co-launched this project called Inhabited Sea, which is a transdisciplinary international collaboration investigating the future of cities from the grounds of Mumbai. And it's a collaborative that includes scholars and activists and artists from the School of Environment and Architecture, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai, CAMP, an arts collective, Marine Life of Mumbai, which Shonak, you see his lovely work here, an amateur science, citizen science collective, and many others, right? So it's across different disciplines and different expertise, but all rooted in the work that's going on in Mumbai. And we want to investigate the city from these grounds of wetness, where ecologies and fish and fishers all inhabit the same terrain. And we invert this convention of planners making plans and leading the way for a few reasons. First is because that planners are not quite doing that. But also, I think, because even the best planning projects always are top down. And they often ignore the expertise of people in marginal locations, such as the communities that we're working with in Mumbai, right? So this is a list of projects that we've organized into 3 clusters. And we're going to be launching the results of this work starting next month with the first cluster of projects around living in rain. And I invite you to contact us if you're interested in joining that session. So I guess there's 3 projects that I thought of talking with. The first cluster of the 3 clusters of projects. The first cluster of projects is called Living in Rain, and it's where environmental and media artists at School of Environment and Architecture and CAMP are paying attention to the ways in which residents are living in wetlands. These are or in floodplains in Borivali and in Mankhurd. And we're trying to understand how they recognize the signs of coming floods, or how they arrange their houses so as not to get wet when the floods come, not if they come, but when the floods come. So for example, residents of Borivali who are living in the floodplain of the Daisar River recognize when the waters will enter their homes by listening to what the drains begin to sound like, which is a sign of water filling up, and quickly move their furniture into different parts of the house that will not get wet. So their spaces are already organized for when these rivers flood. The second cluster of projects, which is called Seeing the City, is being done by colleagues at TIS, at IIT Bombay, and by me. And we're working in Trombe, Kolivada, and Murali, Kolivada on either end of the city's coastline, to understand how fishers both recognize changes in the sea, changes that are both long-term changes, but also short-term changes in the sea, of when it's rough or when it's good to fish, for example, or when it's too polluted to fish. Um, and also how they recognize and arrange their commons in the sea, but also their commons on land, right? Their loading docks, their fish drying areas and the like, to see how these spaces, which are oftentimes at the edge of land and water, are actually used for multiple purposes at different times of the day and the year. And these kinds of flexible arrangements that recognize and accommodate wetness are the kinds of arrangements that we should be thinking of more broadly in urban design in the city. Their activities, for example, of fishing or not fishing, are oriented not around just the solar calendar, but also the lunar calendar, right? So there's this acute sensitivity of when tides come, when fish come, when sewage comes, when floods come, in their decisions to fish or not fish, right? So urban government would be much improved, I'd suggest, if we took into account how the sea, how they account for sea level rise, tides, and the like. And the final collection of, oh, this slide should have been first, sorry. And the final collection of projects is to think about this intertidal region, which is a problematic space. It's a problematic space because it's a space of a lot of pollution, plastics and sewage in particular, but also it also at the same time hosts tremendous biodiversity, right? Different forms of marine life thrive in the intertidal regions of Mumbai. Here you see flamingos, but there are also coral, crabs, sponges, gastropods, zoanthids. It's actually quite stunning. And I invite you to look at Marine Life of Mumbai's work on the website to see the tremendous biodiversity that persists in Mumbai despite the pollution, right? So how do we actually make sense of our tremendous biodiversity that the city continues to host despite these animals oftentimes living quite literally in and on plastics? What might conservation look like in this tremendously anthropogenic habitat? So MLOM, Marine Life of Mumbai, had been bringing people to the shoreline to recognize the tremendous ecology that is sustained by the city and the sea. And we're working with them to try and think about the ways in which these ecologies have like annual and patterns, that this is actually habitat, but also habitat that is tremendously transformed by human activity in the city. So we're trying to understand how plastics come to the beaches, where they go after they're taken away, and what animals that are doing living in and with them. So to conclude, the sea is full of stuff, and people are living in and off it in ways that we barely control. What kinds of infrastructures, what kinds of cities might support our tenuous lives in these times? How might human and non-human life thrive in this city that is in the sea? Land thinking here is completely insufficient. To rethink the future of Mumbai and of coastal cities, we as academics, as historians, as city lovers, as environmentalists, as urbanists, must read, recognize, and plan for cities in water before our cities are underwater. And we must remake our cities quickly and soon, lest we be the frog in hot water that does not quite know it is in hot water until it's too late. Thank you.
Nikhil, you paint a rather dire picture of things. Is there any hope in learning from other cities in the world, how they've combated this, and what, according to you, are the one or two top solutions for this, if I may? Of course, you've spoken about three projects. What do you believe would give the maximum results?
That's a good question. I think there are lots of other cities that have climate change plans, both mitigation and adaptation plans, right? That seek to like secure their cities in these times, right? Now, there's a lot of good in these plans. For example, we can think of Mumbai being threatened by the environment, right? But Mumbai is also producing the environment, right? Mumbai is literally like, for example, the increased intensity of cyclones that are going to be coming to Mumbai is directly related to the amount of uh, carbon in the aerosols in the air, right? So if cities like Mumbai and across the whole Indian coastline start producing fewer aerosols, start emitting less carbon through like automobile pollution, for example, um, there will be less um, there will be less intense cyclones, right? So there's both mitigation projects that need to be like put in place quite quickly, but also adaptation projects. And the adaptation projects are of the kind which recognize that wetness is a condition that the city must accommodate. The city's roads, the city's buildings, the city's water lines, the city's grounds, right? So what are the ways in which we hold the waters of the city versus just try and push them out? Because pushing them out is more and more energy intensive and also liable to technocratic failure, right? And so of the kind that we saw with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. So I think like it's transforming really everything we do in the city, for which there have to be ambitious targets. And there's no single bullet, right? And there's no convenient bullet either, right? Because if there was one, it would be done already.
Okay.
So I think it's doing a lot of these transformative projects, but it's also about trying to reimagine what a good city looks like. And so there's a lot of cases of green urbanism that I can point to that gesture to the kinds of interventions that need to be put in place, using and working with nature as opposed to trying to replace it in the city.
So that was Prashant's comment / question. He says, won't the nature-based solutions be effective and cost effective? And have academicians and planners been thinking about it for Mumbai?
Yeah, the problem with nature-based solutions, Prashant, is that they are cost effective when things are actually much more easily available, right? So maybe just safety, but also securing the city against floods. Those are already excellent examples of urban heritage, and they will not be very expensive. But I think there needs to be a shift to like thinking about those kinds of interventions. Think of a Maidan, right? A Maidan is both a cricket field, but also a flood control infrastructure. We need to be thinking about places like that, that the city needs to both protect what we have and also expand into what we don't have.
Okay. And Aruna was talking about casuarina trees and bamboo plants. How effective would those solutions be?
Yeah. So I think, I tend to see the ways in which, like if there is a need for rainwater harvesting, and I think there is, like in my first book, I was talking about the strangeness of having to like import all of Mumbai's water from Thane, from Shahpur Taluk, when the city actually is sitting on all this water, some of which is already being used, but much of it is not being actively managed. And so I think there are already systems of holding water, of harvesting water, but they're just unsupported. Rainwater harvesting is a very good example of something that is not capital intensive, that is constantly shelved in favor of capital intensive projects. So the city is a lot more willing to spend 500 crores or 5,000 crores on a new dam than it is in supporting communities to both collect and use rainwater. So I think these are the kinds of interventions that unfortunately are not supported because they're not expensive, that the city can afford and cannot afford not to do. Now, whether it's casuarina trees or bamboo or particular kinds of intervention, it depends on the who, the what, the when, and the where. So it's hard for me to say without understanding the context and the locations in which it is being proposed. But there is no silver bullet like that will solve it all, right? But that these situations have to be thought of with the existing social life of the city and the ecology of the city, which, as you know, is tremendously diverse in different parts. So they need to be accounted for accordingly.
You touched upon upon the coastal road, which is this mega infrastructure project which everyone seems to be obsessed about these days. But what about the other one, the RA Metro shed? Um, will it reduce carbon emissions? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? What are your thoughts on the RA Metro shed?
Yeah, I want to like respond to that by thinking like by zooming out for a second.
Hmm.
Which say if like the fundamental need of people in cities is for clean, efficient, convenient transportation, right? And that's the need for people, right? So a transportation problem should be understood as a people problem and not a car problem, right?
Hmm.
And so the question should be, what's the most effective way in terms of carbon intensity, or in terms of intensity of carbon emissions, but also in terms of costs and also in terms of time
Hmm.
for people to be moved. And in that sense, a metro project is always already going to be uh, far superior in every respect than the coastal road. Now, the question then becomes, where do we put this infrastructure? And it's actually really interesting to think of like ways and places in which metros are underground and overground. Um, in high in areas of high real estate value, they oftentimes are buried, and in areas of low real estate value, they come up. But also in terms of where things like car sheds are cited, describe our values as a city, right? So the decision was sort of made to like value the city's biodiversity by situating the car shed in Kanjurmarg, which is an open area, which I hear, I've not been there directly myself, is not a wetland area,
No.
in which case it would make sense to shift it there, right? But these kinds of decisions are decisions of how we value the different kinds of services, the different kind environmental services, but also the people in the city. Um, and I think it's kind of incredible that the work of the Save RA group actually did have some results in resituating the metro shed away from RA.
Could you talk a little bit about the informality which you advocate in your book, Hydraulic City? Neha was asking that she understands um informality as a logic, but instead of just criticizing informality, she wants to know how this gray kind of organizing will help combat these water-based challenges.
Yeah, so in my first book, I like follow the ways in which residents of Mumbai, particularly those living in settlements and slums, are able to secure water access even when the rules of the city restrict their access, right? And the focus of the book was to describe the strange predicament of a city that would insist that people don't have a right to water in their decisions of how to extend water pipes or not. Um, I think oftentimes informality is seen to be the domain or the jagari of the poor and those living in the settlements alone, but actually that informality was also part of getting like permission for water connections in large formal development as well, right? So as Ananya Roy describes informality as a mode of urbanization, right? So these are the kinds of practices that are required outside of the rules to allow for something to like follow the rules, and that's kind of like how I like to think about it. And I think it's that those kinds of arrangements, like from the ground, from practices on the ground, that I want to gesture to in thinking about the city, the climate resilient city as well. Like, what are people already doing in the ground to cope with uncertain terrain? How might we learn from those examples, which might be called informal or not that of the expert, to actually completely refashion cities from the bottom up, as it were, for climate change? So I
Mm.
think Neha's question actually draws attention to the continuity between the two projects. Um, I'm not interested in criticizing informality or even criticizing anything. I'm trying to like rethink the world from the already existing practices in the city more than how it should be from some ideal ivory tower somewhere else, whether the ivory tower is in Mumbai or in Philadelphia.
Um, Amish's observation is that, well, there is misrepresented cartography, but there is also a problem of weak spatial information.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Considering environment, as you mentioned, is not a, a policy of priority. How do you navigate this through these two realities, so to speak?
Mhm. Um, yeah. So I think Amish's question actually talks about how, Amish, like what you're saying is, that there isn't really weak spatial information, right? The Chithle Committee report, the DMC Stormwater Department, everyone has detailed cartographic information. There's amazing reports like the Chithle Committee report that remain reports, right? So it's not about not knowing what to do. And this is what I was saying earlier. It's about the other interests that sort of get in the way of it being done. So this is like not just a technical problem of not knowing how to map or where the information is, or having information systems. So the information systems are actually there. They're just not being utilized for different kinds of reasons. Some of those reasons are just reasons like money, right? Like a real estate project is able to like realign a stormwater drain because it's powerful. It's got money behind it. But it's also some of these issues are problems of the imagination that we see at Glass Tower as progressive development and evidence of the city being world class, where in fact it's actually the most vulnerable structure you can live in when you're being hit by like cyclone force winds, and so I think that that's kind of the reorientation of the imagination that needs to go together with the reorientation of financial interest for the city to thrive.
Yes, and he was also looking. You mentioned the Chitale Commission report. He's looking for answers as to why it has not made it to any stage beyond the report. I think you've answered that indirectly by talking about other interests.
Yeah.
I think the following question is something which would be of great interest in the short term to everybody. At what point do parts of the city become uninhabitable? And how are we thinking about the tipping point? I'm
Yeah.
I'm especially worried because I've got the same two sides.
No, I think that, part of the trouble again with cartography, and, I critique it, but I also use it. And I use one of those maps that Farah produced. Um, we often have seen these maps of the city being underwater in the future, right? The 2050 map in that case. Now, that map is a map of the city being underwater for some of the year or following floods. It's not a permanent condition, right? Now, already, many of us continue to live in Mumbai in neighborhoods like Kalanagar, or Kurla, or Lalbagh, or Parel, all these places that we'll see um, um, now already living with flood on a regular basis, and we will expect to do more of that. I think we should expect to do more of that in the future. Now, how much is enough? It's a hard question, right? It depends on who you are and what your ties to the city are, to work, to social relationships. It depends where in the city you're living, if you're living on low ground or high ground, right? So there isn't a tipping point, right? It just depends on what your investments in living in that particular place are, whether that place is a neighborhood or a city, and at what point you say, okay, this is enough, I'm going to move. It's a very hard question for all of us to think with, but I think it's a series of tipping points and a series of events that will be more frequent, right? So if the cyclone hit the city, would people move? Some may, but most would not. They wait for the next one, right? And I think that's the kind of city that many people are going to continue to experience, um, even with the dire predictions that we are seeing the city
Is
confronting.
decongesting the city a solution? Relocation to other areas?
I mean, again, it depends what is being decongested and where people are being decongested to. Like if people are being moved to like the wetlands of like the mainland, whether that's from like Thane down to Panvel, that may not be the greatest idea, right? That's also wetland. So yeah, I think that might be something to think about. I think more than thinking on a flat surface, we need to be thinking about it topographically in terms of elevation, about which neighborhoods and which parts of the city are more at risk versus the others. But yes, I think I would like to think that there's a lot that still can be done and will be done in the city um, to make a bad flood less bad, you know, to make a bad cyclone less tragic. I think those are the kinds of, it's not. This is why I'm not. I don't like to think with tipping points because it's all about degrees, quite literally, right? A 2-degree change in climate is different from a 2.5-degree change in climate. Similarly, like doing a little bit is better than doing nothing, but not as good as doing a lot. So we always live in grades, and I think we need to start doing, imagining in grades as well for the city.
Is there any bright point that you'd like to leave our audience with in this rather bleak scenario?
Yes, I think like one of the strange things that I've noticed in Mumbai over the last 12 years, 15, I mean, I've lived in Mumbai before coming to university, but in the last 15 years of working in and around Mumbai, is that there is a lot more awareness of the climate emergency that has congealed over the last year than even when I was doing fieldwork in 2018, 2019. I think some of this might be funnily and paradoxically due to the coastal road and the kinds of concerns it animates around people that are living on the coastline. But some of it is also like reading reports that were published, for example, in the New York Times or in the Indian Express about climate risks in the city. So I think there's a lot more concern, awareness. The Environment Minister, Aditya Thackeray, has taken climate change to be a serious issue. Now we have to see how much he's able to like do with it, rearrange the city with that as a governing logic. So that's like a bright spot. We always want something to hold on to, but I think who was it Amish that pointed out that there's knowledge happened there, but now we need to like push what needs to happen now.
Okay, we shall make it actionable, hopefully. Thank you so much, Nikhil. It was a real pleasure getting this insight. It may not be a very bright picture, but forewarned is forearmed for our viewers. So thank you very much.